Sci-Fi. Readers and Writers Corner. A little corner of the universe for readers and writers of sci-fi. Today I'm starting a series on a book that has expanded my world. Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. And today I'm going to talk about the first two books in the series, Shadow of the Torturer and Claw of the Concilliator. This will by no means be like a comprehensive overview of the series. There is so much in the books. Every chapter has like a mystery, or at least like a cool, strange animal that attacks. But I'm just going to talk about the things in the book that have had the biggest impact on me, the things that I was the most interested in, and stuff like that. I read the whole series, including Earth of the New Sun, and I'm on my first reread and just finished Shadow and Claw, which is the collection of the first two books. So here we go. I was a little hesitant to start this series because I thought that it might be like a lot of scenes of detailed descriptions of torture, and there definitely are books like that. I don't really have any interest in reading a book like that. It turns out that there's actually only a few scenes of torture, and they're not gratuitous, but they are incredibly disturbing. And the whole aspect of torture is, I think, a important element of the novel that the other people I've heard talking about it seem to overlook. The first scene describing it is in the chapter called The Autarch's Face, and it's exactly what you would expect for a guild of torturers. You have the master instructing the student with a person right there with their knee torn open, and he's discussing all the things they've done and the drugs they've given to what they call the client to keep her conscious. And it's like medically descriptive and horrific because of the desensitization to the horror of it. And the next scene involving torture is in the chapter called The Traitor, where Thecla is being brought to her excruciation, and the torturers are speaking to her very politely, using very formal language. Those two scenes, the first time I read it, were very disturbing, and I remember that it even stayed with me for a couple of days, just like a sick feeling from reading those scenes. Another sense I got from the first time I read this book was it sort of reminded me of Edgar Allan Poe when Severian is talking about his childhood, especially when he's lying in the necropolis and studying nature, and he's lying right next to a mummified corpse, which may be actually not a corpse, but a like brass shape of a corpse on top of a sarcophagus or something like that. But I remember the first time I read it, I had the impression that he was just chilling and looking at the birds and the flowers lying next to a dead body. And Severian says very early in the novel that I am in some degree insane. Severian's character is actually kind of the story of the novel, I think. It's easy to forget where he came from because his personality through most of the book is extremely polite, usually, and stoic. He has a sense of honor. He definitely seems honest with the reader because he tells about his shortcomings and he tells about when he lies and stuff like that. But it's not like he grew up in the Torturers Guild and then he just went on to these other adventures. I think the fact that he was raised literally inside the human institution of torture and then goes to experience the world and discover his own beliefs and his own heart, I think that's what the book is all about. A bunch of things struck me on the reread of this first book. One is the chapter called The Last Year, which talks about when Thecla was a prisoner for like a year in the tower before the orders came for her execution. there's a lot of descriptions of the seasons and the nature around, and it just struck me as a very beautiful chapter, because it's like Severian was falling in love with her, but yet it was doomed. And another thing that struck me on the reread is from the chapter where Severian goes to the brothel, the House Azur, and he chooses the prostitute that's dressed up like Thekla, and he's telling her that she isn't really Thekla, and she says, "Aren't you strong enough to master reality even for a little while?" And Severian says, "What do you mean?" And she says, "Weak people believe what is forced on them. Strong people what they wish to believe, forcing that to be real. What is the autarch but a man who believes himself autarch and makes other people believe by the strength of it?" I thought that was an interesting bit of foreshadowing, considering the way that Severian becomes autarch later in the books. That's no big spoiler. He says, I think in the first chapter, that he becomes autarch. But there definitely will be spoilers in this review, and also if you haven't read it, then probably the things I'm talking about, it won't make any sense. A lot of people talk about this book and talk about how Severian is an unreliable narrator. That seems to be the thing that people are the most interested in, even though I don't really think he's unreliable. I'm not really sure. I think he's telling the truth as best as he remembers it, and he constantly talks about his perfect memory. But I've been trying to keep a list here of places where his memory contradicts itself. In the very first chapter, where they're outside the gates of the necropolis, his buddy Roach says, "Wait, I see pikes." And then later in the same chapter, he says, "They had pikes, as Drott had said." Drott's his other buddy. So that's a mistake. And then just a little bit after that, he talks about how perfect his memory is. Okay, that might be a coincidence, might be a mistake, but in the first chapter of the second book, the same exact thing happens. He says, Vodalis gave his pistol to his mistress, meaning Thea. But if you go back to the first book, he actually handed off the pistol to one of his men. And in that same first chapter of the second book, he also talks about perfect memory. So if Wolfe is trying to point out that there are discrepancies in his perfect memory, what is the point? I'm not exactly sure. In the chapter The Hut in the Jungle, where the naked man is talking, he's talking about the Tokoloshi, or the Tokolosh. And they ask, what are the Tokolosh? And he says, bad spirits, preceptor. When man think bad thought, or woman do bad thing, there is another Tokolosh. He stay behind. Man think, no one know, everyone dead, but Tokolosh remain until the end of the world. Then everyone will see, know what man did. This reminds me very much of a theme that I've been thinking about in other stories, which is mankind's inability to heal from trauma when it's obscured. And in chapter 31, there's a beautifully written part where Severian talks about an aspect of himself that's hiding from his own truth or something. Here's the quote. The leaf had not killed me, but I had turned my mind from my survival, just as a man suffering from a deadly sickness manages by 1,000 tricks never to look at death squarely, or rather, as a woman alone in a large house refrains from looking into mirrors, and instead busies herself with trivial errands, so that she may catch no glimpse of the thing whose feet she hears at times on the stairs. There's a really dark undercurrent, which is the reality of himself and the reality of the world. The more I read this, the more I kind of think the world of this novel is Severian. In the first book, he's leaving the Citadel, and it takes a long time because the Citadel is massive. And I really like this part because I'm not sure if it's intended this way, but I kind of got the sense that a lot of stuff which is outside is actually still inside. Like there's times where I thought he was walking down a street, but he's actually in a corridor and shows up at a library and stuff like that. It kind of reminds me of some dreams I've had where I'm walking through some massive hotel or something where I thought I was like in a stairwell, but then suddenly I'm like in someone's room. And I also got that feeling from a novel I read called High Rise by J.G. Ballard, which is also about like a self-contained community inside a building. I might do my next review on that novel. That's a really good one. Shadow of the Torturer concludes when Severian reaches the wall at the edge of the Citadel. And that's a strange and confusing thing in itself. The wall is massive. And it has, like, places you can see into it where there are living creatures. And reaching the wall brings us to the second novel, Claw of the Concilliator. I'll take a moment here to talk about the book covers. These covers are all right. They're based on the American releases, which were done by Don Mates. But I really dig the UK covers, which were done by Bruce Pennington. And here are some of the paintings that those covers are based on. Really cool stuff. I'm turning into kind of a collector of 70s and 80s paperbacks with cool covers before the 90s when, in my opinion, book cover designs turned to crap. Probably when people started making them on computers. I just don't dig the design. And those UK paperbacks are kind of hard to find, a little pricey. I got my hands on one of them so far, but eventually I will catch them all. Gene Wolfe's vision of the Earth in thousands of years is kind of a deconstruction of the current world. Claw of the Concilliator opens with a vision of Morwena's head and the execution of Morwena. I remember on my first read is when I realized that even though Severian isn't talking a lot about how growing up as a torturer has affected him, the brutality of all that stuff is always there under the surface, not just in his soul but in the world. Again, it's not an explicitly detailed scene. To me, the worst part is after he brands her and breaks her legs and cuts off her head, her accuser runs to the front, Eusebia. And Severian is reveling in the crowd's reaction to his first execution. But Eusebia, who wanted the execution and accused her, has such a realistic speech, which sort of is mixing her glory at getting what she wanted and absolute misery at getting what she wanted. And she's basically saying she probably was innocent. This speech to me is horrific. And of course, Eusebia dies. And there's a lot of debate about how it happened. I've seen a bunch of discussion on Reddit on whether Morwena was innocent and how Eusebia died from the flowers. Severian sort of offhandedly says, well, Morwena must have thrown poison on the flowers while I was parading her around the stage. I find that specious, to say the least. The way Morwena conducted herself at the execution makes me think that she was innocent of the crime. I probably think that Wolfe wants the whole situation to remain a question. This is the world. Everyone is guilty and innocent, and the details of the truth are always 3 times obscured. But how did the flowers kill Eusebia? I really don't have an answer to that one yet. But one possibility is that Severian did it with the claw powers. If it has the ability to heal people and even bring people back from the dead, perhaps it has the ability to bring people to the dead. It could be acting that way. It's just one possibility. Here's another cool thing I found in the reread. In chapter 11, when Vodalus's guards are leading Severian and Jonas, they're kind of taunting them, and there's a voice from the back that Severian doesn't recognize who it's coming from. And it says, "You're gonna drown yourself again?" But how would any of Vodalus's guards had known that Severian had almost drowned either of those times? So that's kind of a clue that someone's following him. Book 2 gets pretty insane with all the stuff with the blood bats and the living statues and all the insane stuff that happens in the antechamber. It was only on the second read that I figured out that the people tormenting the prisoners were like bored rich exultants, probably young women, because Severian gets a memory of Thecla preparing to do that. And it's not stated, but it could only be from Thecla's memories that Severian got the word of power to open the secret door to escape from the antechamber. And then it only gets weirder and weirder, walking through the mysterious corridors of the House Absolute. And to be honest, Dr. Talos' play is still quite a mystery to me. I can say that on the second read, I could much better easily visualize which actors were playing which parts. And I know that the play is supposedly a version of The Coming of the New Sun, based on some version of Severian's manuscript that traveled back in time. But it's not easy to figure out exactly what the heck they're talking about in the play. One thing that I kind of understood about it was after the play when they're traveling with Jolenta and Severian is sewing the wounds on her wrists, which were supposedly from an animal, but there is kind of like a suicide feeling about that location. And she's like half conscious, and she says a line that Severian doesn't instantly recognize, but is a line from the play. And she says, "Now you see that he, whom you have esteemed your divinity, would countenance and advise all I have proposed to you. Before the new sun rises, let us make a new beginning." And that strikes me as possibly like the counter movement against the plan of the new sun, which Severian has to face in Earth of the New Sun in terms of all the people trying to kill him. Because for the new sun to come, there has to be like a killing of everyone on the planet. And maybe those people who are trying to assassinate him on the space journey in Earth of the New Sun are the same people who are trying to do it here with the nodules and stuff. I don't really know who sent the nodules or the salamander after Severian, but that's my best guess at this point. There's probably going to be a third reread. When Jonas is tripping in the antechamber, he's flipping out about piecing together the history of this prison. And the thing I think that's shocking him is that it was never meant to be a permanent prison, that the people were supposed to just like be there for a while and then released. And now some of them are many, many generations in. And I think there's a correlation there to the story that Severian reads from the Brown Book, where something happens because of a terrible misunderstanding. The student dies because he believes that his dreams are dead, but in fact they were returning from a journey which was more mysterious and wondrous than he had imagined. This sort of feels like a theme of this part of the book, of man's history being unknown and never intended to go as far into madness. In chapter 23, I didn't find another memory contradiction, but he's bragging about his memory again, and he says an interesting sentence. He calls his memory recorded by the demonic witness who dwells behind my eyes. That's another little clue that sort of points to how, as Severian is carrying on with this quest and the personality he shows to everyone, there's a darker world inside him. And when they meet the witches, he describes a memory of visiting the witches' tower in Nessus when he was so young that he had to jump up to reach the knocker, I think they said. And it's just sort of passed over quickly, but he talks about how before he went, he had to wash his hands so that they wouldn't be red, and he didn't want the witches to see him with red hands. He just passes by this, but red hands means that at that young age, they already had him doing bloody torture work in the guild. And I found that especially chilling, especially because he makes no other mention of that at all as the memory goes on, leading the reader to have to piece together exactly what would the childhood of an orphan growing up inside the guild of the torturers be like. Book 2 ends with an awesome psychedelic visit back to the past, wrestling with Apu Punchow, and a really interesting quote at the end. Jolenta finally looks like the waitress she was before Dr. Talos' treatments, and Severian says, "That we are capable only of being what we are remains our unforgivable sin." All right, these are just some of my highlights of the first 2 books. I'm starting on a reread of Sword of the Lictor. I hope you enjoyed it. Drop some comments, and thank you for visiting my little corner of the Commonwealth. See you back for the next one.